So now I will invite Adam Saifer. Adam is with the PhiLab, and he will talk about the qualitative study of challenges faced by community organization, and especially also diversity and equity of nonprofit.
Okay, so as Francois mentioned, I'm going to be talking about a qualitative study I did last summer on the experiences of equity-focused grantees during the first few months of the pandemic. So sort of to set the stage, so as we know, in the summer of 2020, conversations around social and economic injustice were reaching an inflection point in the Canadian philanthropic sector. COVID-19 was both revealing and intensifying deep-rooted racial, gender, and class disparities in Canadian society. Likewise, grassroots movements against anti-Black racism, racial injustice, and police brutality were holding powerful institutions to account for these inequities. At the same time, philanthropic funders are being challenged by practitioners and community stakeholders to re-examine where their financial assets were coming from, where they ended up, as well as who exactly was being tasked with making these sorts of decisions. Since then, we've heard a lot from and about philanthropic funders regarding some of the ways that the sector has responded to the crisis. This includes, among other things, increasing grant-making expenditure and loosening restrictions on how grants can be spent. However, often missing from these critical conversations were and continue to be the qualitative experiences and perspectives of grantee organizations during the pandemic. And I'll say specifically the grantee organizations doing equity-based work on the front lines with the communities that were most impacted by the pandemic. So I spent the summer of 2020 conducting interviews with leaders from 30 equity-focused grantee organizations in Montreal and Toronto in order to learn how their organizations were experiencing and responding to the COVID-19 pandemic. These interviews are part of a larger qualitative study that I'd be happy to talk about in the Q&A as well, looking at how equity-focused grantees understand, experience, and navigate the implementation of DEI approaches at the funder level. When I use the term equity-focused grantee, it's not a fixed term. It's sort of a loose term that I'm using to refer to organizations that grantees that engage in some form of progressive social change or political advocacy work, in addition to the kinds of direct service work that we more typically see within the sector. These organizations, the ones that I spoke with, varied in terms of their focus, including focusing on refugee claimant rights, anti-Black racism, LGBTQ youth homelessness, criminal justice reform, just to name a few. And it's also important to reiterate again that these grantees work almost exclusively with racialized, Indigenous, LGBTQ, and poor and working class communities. So in other words, the communities most impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic in Canada. So that's the background. Today, I'm going to be talking about just a few of the key findings from this sort of snapshot in time research. Okay. So COVID-19's disproportionate impact on marginalized communities forced many equity-focused grantees to reevaluate their organization's priorities. Stacey Kelly, who's the director of philanthropy at the 519, which for those of you who don't know is likely Toronto's largest LGBTQ advocacy organization, he paints a clear picture of this process. Quote, "The 519 that existed on March 14th doesn't exist anymore. We have completely reorganized our organization. With very few exceptions, like myself, the role you had doesn't exist anymore. You are now an essential services worker, and we're doing essential services 7 days a week. That's all we do. Everyone has been completely retrained, and it's 7 days a week. Meals, clothing, harm reduction, counseling." Because the 519 is a well-funded organization, they have roughly $6.5 million in annual revenue, and they have a sizable staff of around 50 full-time paid staff. They were able to successfully reinvent themselves as a provider of essential services and emergency goods very, very quickly. Now, Of course, most equity-focused grantees don't have the same access to resources and staff capacity as an organization like the 519. However, it's important to note that many smaller equity-focused grantees still engaged in a similar process of reflection and reprioritization. Often this included shifting their organizational energy and resources away from core programming toward, for example, one-on-one phone check-ins with clients in their programs. And these sorts of one-on-one community interactions were seen as essential in those early months of the pandemic. While some grantees pivoted from core programming toward essential services and community supports, others responded by expanding existing services to meet the increased economic, social, and psychological challenges faced by the communities they serve. For example, Head in Hands, a Montreal-based organization that works with marginalized and street-involved youth, dramatically extended their food pantry program. And while the program used to provide meals only for youth and their families, during the pandemic, they opened up the program to include anyone who needed it. They also changed the frequency of the program from once a month to once a week. Though the specific nature of their responses differed, the leaders that I spoke to expressed that they felt that they had no choice but to shift or abandon their core programming in order to fill in the significant gaps in public support that COVID-19 revealed. In doing so, however, the once prominent social justice or advocacy component of the work that they do took a backseat to more traditional charitable work, or what they call essential charitable work. This understanding of social change or advocacy work as less essential seemed to really take hold in the early months of the pandemic. As one participant who works with newcomers in Canada told me, quote, "We're all in pandemic brain. Basically, we're like, what's the point? Who cares if anyone is doing language acquisition right now? People are not eating and people are struggling." In fact, some equity-focused grantees received this sort of messaging or similar messaging from their funders. Marie-José Fizet, director of an organization that runs educational workshops for youth on racism, sexism, and homophobia, explains that she, quote, "received letters and answers from funders saying, it's not because we're not interested in your cause or your group or whatever. No, it's just because of this period. Our money and our energy are going to help people with COVID." In this way, the pandemic, or at least the early months of the pandemic, positioned some equity-focused grantees in a very complex and contradictory position. In normal times, these organizations seek to create a more socially just and equitable society that better serves racialized, Indigenous, LGBTQ, and poor and working class communities. However, when the pandemic hit, equity-focused grantees felt that they had to take on the role of essential service provider with the support of their funders. Paradoxically, the social justice or political advocacy work that define equity-focused grantees were redefined as non-essential during the pandemic, even though this work seeks to eliminate the kinds of inequalities that the COVID-19 pandemic revealed and magnified. While a few equity-focused grantees were able to maintain some semblance of their in-person operations, the vast majority of organizations I spoke with moved their programs and services online. While this was common across the sector, the shift online created some unique challenges for equity-focused grantees. To begin, COVID-19 highlighted huge disparities in access to computers and high-speed internet across Canada. This digital divide reflects existing social and economic inequalities, and as a result, created challenges for many grantees that work with people and youth from equity-seeking communities. As Katie Hutchison, who's the executive director of Vibe Arts, explains, the youth they work with, quote, "usually don't have access to the best computers or an iPad or even stable internet. These are kids who are using the library as their babysitter after school. We know that there's a huge subsection of kids and youth that are not receiving the same sort of programming that they once were getting." A second challenge associated with moving online is that a lot of equity-focused grantee programming relies on bringing people together to interact in a shared physical space. For example, a number of arts-based grantees I spoke with noted that their programs seem to lose their power and effectiveness when mediated by a computer, a smartphone, or a tablet screen. Or as the artistic director of one anti-racist theater group told me, quote, "I had to go see so many horrible presentations that tried to take theater and move it online, and it just doesn't work. It's not working." For some equity-focused grantees, the shift online also eliminated much of the intrinsic or difficult to quantify value of their programming. Someone explained to me that part of the benefit of their events and programs resulted from being in a room with 800 other people like them. The beneficiaries of their program build community and they feel like they're not alone. They meet people who are talking to them about educational opportunities and career opportunities. And it's really the energy of being together as a group that sort of lends power to their program. While the shift to online programs and services impacted the entire sector, the challenges that equity-focused grantees faced were threefold. First, there was the client's lack of access to digital devices and high-speed internet at home to continue to participate in programming, even if the organization was able to move their programs online. Second, a lot of the smaller organizations described a lack of resources for R&D to be able to adapt to the situation. And finally, as I mentioned, the suspension of in-person interactive and community building programs and activities had a real impact on a lot of the work that these grantee organizations do. With only a few exceptions, the grantees I spoke with reported that philanthropic funders have actually been extremely supportive during the first few months of the pandemic. This support has, as we've heard, this support has taken on three specific forms, or three main forms. The agility to redirect funds to new emergency funding opportunities, proactively contacting grantees to determine how they can help, and flexibility with grant outcomes and reporting. In fact, participants often contrasted philanthropy's agility and flexibility with the strict requirements that they were facing from government funders. As one participant told me, quote, "Government funders have been the most staunch in requiring you to fulfill the grant requirements, despite them saying we're going to have lots of flexibility." She then contrasts this with her experience with philanthropy. Quote, "I've reached out to some of our long-term donors and asked if I could convert their project money into sustaining dollars for the organization. And we've actually had a lot of success in doing that. And now we're able to continue to work, which is great." In fact, there's echoing the previous presentation, there's actually been a lot of hope among equity-focused grantee leaders that the agility and flexibility that philanthropy has displayed in their response to the COVID-19 pandemic could serve as a basis for a new model of philanthropic and public grant making moving forward. The leaders I spoke with did describe that this flexibility was grounded in existing relationships of trust that had been established between funders and grantees. For example, organizations with long-term established partnerships with funders felt like they were given more leeway than those with more recently established partnerships. For example, Paul Clark of Action Réfugiés Montréal explains that at the beginning of the crisis, he received a number of proactive emails and some of the most important COVID-19 response work. These include caremongering networks, mutual aid networks, and social movements. The leaders that I spoke to within the equity-focused grantee organizations highlighted that these regulatory barriers need to be re-examined in order to allow the sector to have a better response to future crises. Finally, some of the participants in the study expressed feelings of uncertainty around philanthropy's reliance on financial markets and the performance of their endowments, both of which can be affected by future health, economic, and ecological crises. Specifically, they asked whether or wondered whether foundations will give less during times of crisis in order to maintain their endowments, or if they will prioritize ethical investments at the expense of their endowments. While these concerns aren't specific to the COVID-19 context, the COVID-19 context nevertheless brought these anxieties to the forefront for equity-focused grantee leaders as they worry about philanthropy's ability to support them in inevitable future crises. So yeah, there's four key takeaways as I see it from this sort of snapshot qualitative research. The first is that COVID-19 has highlighted the tension between short-term essential work and long-term social change work that equity-focused grantees must constantly navigate. While equity-focused grantees believe that their social change advocacy work is key to mitigating the unequal impact of crises, COVID-19 left these organizations with no choice but to focus their energy on short-term essential services. Second, as COVID-19 has required organizations to move their programs and services online, equity-focused grantees have faced challenges due to the digital divide and an inability to translate the intrinsic value of their in-person programs to an online format. Third, philanthropy's agility and flexibility during COVID-19 has been a clear strength, according to grantees. And moreover, this can serve as or should serve as a model for the sector moving forward, as well as government grant making. And finally, COVID-19 has raised concerns about the long-term viability of the current philanthropic model as a mechanism to support equity-focused grantees. For participants, this specifically concerns the limitations created by project-based funding, current regulations regarding who qualifies, or who is a qualified donee and who is a non-qualified donee, and the philanthropic sector's inherent reliance on the market performance of their endowments in order to support grantees. So this is the end of my presentation. I'd be happy to talk about these takeaway points, themes, as well as any more general questions you may have about the perspectives of equity-focused grantees in the philanthropic sector as well. Thank you.